Hey y'all, CJ here. So I'm going to be talking about fellowships that PhD students will apply for. This is mostly in the US, and most of the fellowships I've gone through have had a requirement of US citizenship, but please learn from these lessons because especially in this field of machine learning, there are a bunch of more fellowships, especially from companies like Google and NVIDIA, where they do not have a US citizenship requirement, so it's open to anyone who's international. But later on you'll learn about that there's not a lot of feedback from that. So then there is feedback from a lot of US citizen-based fellowships that I'll kind of talk about to kind of leverage from that, because throughout this whole talk, y'all were learning a lot about different research areas and professors and people who did a lot of cool stuff. And the whole thing is that they're teaching an AI, a machine learning algorithm, a model with data, but in this case it's going to be a little bit more different. Here, hopefully you can learn a representation for how to approach these fellowships, because they can provide a lot of cool benefits while you're a PhD student and kind of set you up for success. And there are some nuances in how to go around with it, just like with all the different research areas that people talked about, like most of you talked about natural language processing, and talked about like the different issues that come around it. And with all these different fellowships that I've gone through and was fortunate enough to receive it, there were different metrics that you had to go to, just like in machine learning. Sometimes you have to look at the metrics, such as binary cross entropy loss, or the dice loss, or L1 or L2 loss. So you have to think about how, for certain fellowships, how should I approach it? Because not all of them are going to be the same. Some of them have shared commonalities, but you have to understand what is it that they want and how to focus on that and optimize for it. So then for the outline, I'm going to kind of talk about what fellowships are, because there are different definitions of it, especially like if you think about Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring. We're not talking about Lord of the Rings in this case. There's not that type of fellowship. This is a different type. And also talk about the difference between master's and PhD, because I'm going to focus more on the PhD route. And also why should you apply for it, and then through the application process, what the components are, and then this concept that I kind of learned from a different professor called the 3 C's for the application process, and things you should take into mind about when you're applying, how to do it in a principled manner. And then I will talk about some of the fellowships that I was fortunate enough to receive, such as NSF, GRFP, NDSEC, and Ford Foundation, and give some pro tips about what I did, what happened, and what were some things to learn from it, because all of these are different agencies. NSF is National Science Foundation, NDSEC is from DoD, Department of Defense, or as I call them, Team America, and then Ford Foundation, this is very different from Ford Motor Company. It is not them. They are part of the National Research Council within the US, and they care about research and also diversity. But then just some general tips, and then also there are other fellowships around, just as I was saying, like we saw the sponsors, there's like NVIDIA, there's an NVIDIA fellowship, there's a Google one, there's a Microsoft one, there's a Facebook/Meta one, depending on if you use them as Facebook or if you use them as Meta. And that's why they're open to international students, and they have different requirements and nuances into like when you can apply and when you cannot. And then also the situation of what happens if you get too many fellowships. That's kind of like a good problem, but you also have to understand the consequences that come with that. So basically, what are fellowships? A very easy version is when you're an undergrad, you had something called a scholarship, and basically in the US, they tie the name scholarship to when you're getting an undergrad. When you're trying to go for grad school, either for the master's or the PhD, they will say that the term that you use now is fellowship, because they're going to give you money, which is the same thing as when you applied for scholarships back in undergrad. But there are some nuances, such as they may have a work requirement, especially if you're going for a master's. Your company is usually going to pay for it, and usually they're going to want you to work for X amount of years after you get your master's degree for the master's fellowship. And then you may have an obligation to work for the organization when you graduate. There are some, like when you work for a company and want to do a master's, they'll usually have that obligation. For some of the companies like NVIDIA, Microsoft, they do have an optional summer internship, so there's also that benefit as well, but it's optional. And then there are a bunch of different types of fellowships. So there's universities that provide their own based on the grant money that they provide. This I'm not going to cover because a bunch of universities and a bunch of different departments have different fellowships, and it's so hard to keep track of it. You have to talk to the universities and the departments about which fellowships they have. When I was at Rice, incoming PhD students would either get a TI fellowship, which TI stands for Texas Instruments, since we're in Texas, and then there's also the Distinguished TI Fellowship, which has a higher stipend. And then there's also the external ones, which is also a company one, whether you work at that company, usually it'll be a master's fellowship, or if you're trying to apply for it as a PhD student, such as the NVIDIA one, the Google one, the Facebook/Meta, Qualcomm even has one. Like there's a bunch of them, especially in machine learning, that have popped up. Even recently during COVID, Twitch had one, which if some of you aren't familiar with Twitch, they're basically YouTube, but they do live streaming, especially for video games. And then of course there's national or government agencies, such as in the US, you have Department of Defense, which is Team America, and then you have Department of Energy, which is also another facet of Team America, but the energy portion, and then you have National Science Foundation, which is very ubiquitous. If you're a professor here in the US, you hear that name a lot. And then maybe in other countries like in Latin America, you have other different government agencies who are willing to provide different types of funding. Like I know in Mexico, they have something called CONACYT, which provides different types of fellowships, but they have different nuances and different situations. And there's also the Fulbright, where if you're coming from a different country and want to study in the US, there's that type of fellowship for international students. So of course we want to talk about the difference between a master's and a PhD, just so that everyone's on the same foot. Some people may not know the differences. So for a master's, it usually takes about 2 years. You have a thesis or a non-thesis option. And in this case, if you're doing a non-thesis option, you don't need to have an advisor. For some people, the term advisor you may not be familiar with. Other terms people use is PI. And then as well as you'll probably need to find funding because it's only for 2 years. That's why the university may not be willing to fund you, because you learn a lot of really good skills in graduate school, and then you're gone for 2 years. So that's why a lot of professors may not be willing to pay for it. It is not the norm that they will be willing to pay for it unless you talk to those professors or advisors and say, hey, will you fund me for a master's? And sometimes they will, but in most of the situations that I've seen, it's not the norm. That's why companies are willing to pay for it, because it's only 2 years, and then they might have a requirement saying for every year you're getting your master's, you owe me 2 extra years so that you can't leave unless you would have to pay it back. And then for a PhD, it takes about 4 to 7 years. It depends if you already came with a master's or if you already came with a bachelor's. And in this case, you also have to have an advisor. And for an advisor, that means a professor, and each professor has different thresholds. Even in the same department, some advisors may have differences depending on if you're wanting to work in industry, a research industry position, or academia. I hear academia can be a little bit brutal, where you need to have more publications, that's why for the PhD, there's a need to publish conference and journal papers. In the master's, if you're doing a thesis option, your advisor may want to, but it's more prevalent when you're doing the PhD. And then in this case, it's probably funded by the school or the advisor. In most cases, if you're doing a STEM PhD, like science, technology, engineering, or math, especially machine learning, you're probably going to get it funded. The ones that don't fund it probably won't have a lot of people enrolled in that program. And then you'll also have like a qualifying exam, additional coursework on top of the master's, because in the master's you will have coursework. And then you also have to give your dissertation, which is at the end. And it's a culmination of all the research that you have done. And then your advisor and other committee members will say yay or nay. For the most part, it's a yay. So then for the PhD situation, you saw it took 4 to 7 years and requires other things. So if it's already being funded, why should I even apply for these external fellowships? I'm already getting it covered. Why should I? Well, for the first part, we're here in machine learning. It's very popular. You have a lot of awesome professors, especially the keynotes that we've had, and the keynote we're going to have next with Maria Ortega. They're awesome professors, and you can imagine a lot of students want to work with them. And even in the case in the US, there's only so many students per professor, either depending on how much funding they get from grants and other amounts of funding sources. So maybe in 1 year, there may be 10 students who are interested in one professor, but they only have 5 slots. So if you come in with an external fellowship like I did, then that professor can see you as essentially free. So then they don't have to pay for you, they don't have to pay for stipend or something, depending on which fellowships you get. So you can join that group even if it's being crowded, because the professor doesn't have to pay you depending on which fellowships you get, because depending on the amount and how many years it covers, then you can join the group. So that makes it easy if there's a lot of competition in that advisor that you want, as well as freedom of research topic, because for a lot of the professors, they have applied to a lot of grants, especially in the US, the NSF grants, the DoD grants, the DOE grants, and if they get it funded, then there's an expectation of the research that they wrote in their proposals to get it working. So then the students do the work along with the postdocs or the advisor to get the deliverables. So then if you come in with a fellowship, especially one that pays your stipend and some of your tuition, then you can have more freedom of what type of research you want to do, versus sometimes your advisor says, here's the scope of the project that we have to do, and you're more constrained to that. And then as well as it prepares you in the art of grant writing. If you want to be a professor, one major thing is, I'm not an expert, but from what everyone tells me, is that you have to learn how to write grants, and you have to know how to communicate effectively, because it is a lot of competition, because you're writing a grant to National Science Foundation, another person is writing to it, and so on and so forth. So it is really good to know how to write effectively, especially since all of us are wanting to submit to ICML, NeurIPS, and all these other conferences. Having high impact papers is really important, and you want to be able to communicate your idea effectively. And of course, an increase in stipends. Some of the universities may not pay as well. So then with some of these stipends from these fellowships, they do pay a little bit more. I think I heard that the Microsoft one is $42,000 in the US, which I think is much more than what a typical PhD student at some universities are, especially if you're living in a city that's very costly, such as Palo Alto and Stanford, or in NYU, New York City. To get rent there, it's pretty expensive. So then some typical application components you're going to have is the application packet, where it just asks for all your general information. You're going to also need letter of references or recommendations. These are from professors or other people you've worked with in internships. Usually the number is between 3 to 5. On average, I hear 3, sometimes 4. You'll also have to send in your transcripts, depending on if you're starting as a beginning PhD student versus you're already like 3rd, 4th, or 5th year. You may need transcripts for your undergrad when you're beginning your PhD, because they want to see your grades and your accolades back in undergrad. And then you'll have a linear combination of these, such as a personal statement, your previous research, or your proposed research, or if you're applying for a diversity fellowship that some of these companies or other agencies provide, you'll probably have to write a diversity statement. This is something that I had to do for the Ford Foundation, because that's what they focus on a lot. So then this I got from Philip Guo. I think he's a professor at University of California, San Diego. And he also had a blog post talking about this. I don't think his website is there anymore, but I got a lot of inspiration from this. And when you're applying for when you're writing your application, think about these 3 C's: completeness, clarity, and coherence. And in the next following slides, I'm going to go more in depth about what the details are about that. So then for completeness, you want to make sure that you complete all the application and the stuff that requires from the application, especially the letters of recommendation. And also do think about that. If they do ask for an optional recommendation letter, think about it as mandatory, because some of them will say we only require 3, but you can send up to 5. Maybe think about having a 4th or a 5th one, so that the reviewers can have a better representation of who you are, because remember, they only have so many samples. Remember when Monsieur gave his talk about when doing zero-shot learning, you only have so many speakers, and in this case, the reviewers only have so many letters of recommendation. If they only ask for 3, if they only require 3 but ask for more, think about how those other letters of recommendation can provide a good representation of who you are, because they only have so many instances of you. And also in this case, do ask them well in advance, because do remember, they are professors, they are very busy, they do have a lot of things to do, a lot of grants, a lot of students, and also they also might have families, so they also have to take care of the kids and the significant other. So give them as much time, and also ensure that you want to vet your references, because you want them to write a great letter of recommendation. I think for a lot of these fellowships, they really look at the letters of recommendation to see your potential. And also, I've seen this happen, that some professors do not submit the letter on time because they were not aware of the deadline, and they also did not have enough time to write a good one. So I've seen this happen a lot, and I've even seen some advisors not send in their letter of recommendation to their student. So that does not create a good application. So you should be very mindful of this, because especially if your advisor does not send a letter of recommendation, that's not a good sign for the reviewers. It does happen, and as I said, I don't want any of you to ever experience that. I've seen other people do that, and all the time that you spent goes to nothing, because pretty much you're going to kind of get disqualified. And then for clarity, when you're writing your application and everything, do not brain dump, because you want to see how am I going to optimize my application, such as the essays, and how am I going to write it, and write it in a concise manner, such that it's simple, direct, and clear, because the unfortunate situation is that you're probably going to spend a couple hours on it, but the unfortunate realization is that these reviewers are probably going to spend around maybe minutes or to an hour, because they have a lot of other deadlines that they have to meet. So you have to make sure that your point is across, that once they read it the first time, they can gain the whole understanding of what your approach is, or what your fellowship application is. It is unfortunate, but that is kind of the reality that is happening with some of these fellowships. And also do think about the target audience that they want. especially with the National Science Foundation, they only say use technical jargon only when needed, because in some cases, if you're applying for, say, machine learning or something like applied math, there may be different areas of applied math or different areas of machine learning. So someone who does, imagine I'm writing an application for natural language processing, but one of my reviewers may be computer vision, so they may not know that as much technical jargon, so they may be overburdened by it, so you have to make sure it's as impactful that people can understand it. But also sometimes they say that an expert is going to read your essays, such as in the NDSEG, the National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship. They explicitly say it in the direction saying, someone in your field is going to read this, so use technical jargon when you feel good and want to put it into your essay. As well as ask others to review your writing material so that you can gain an understanding of who can understand what your message is. And also think about what knowledge do they know? Are they an expert in your field, or are they not, or are they tangential? Because one interesting thing is, even if they aren't in your field, what if they have the same concerns as someone who's reviewing it and gives you the same comments? Then you know for certain, or with high probability, that the reviewer would have the same concerns that both audience people are having, because you know that someone within your field and someone outside your field are having the same concerns. So that's why it's good to have multiple people. Think about it like in statistics or probability theory of like the law of large numbers. You start to converge to the mean, and you get to gain an understanding of how this is my representation of my application essay, and this is what people are getting. Of course, there's going to be some mean and variance, but you at least gain some understanding about it, and that's why I use the whole approach that you've been doing in research to do the same thing in the fellowship application. Build a representation. What is the latent dynamics? How should I approach it? How are people going to understand it? Take that approach that you all have been doing for machine learning and do it for yourself. Teach yourself. So this is as well human learning as well as machine learning. And I think this one is very important. It's not a make or break, but I do see this happen a lot, and it's all about cohesion, because you have your application materials that I talked about, as well as your letters of recommendation and your essays. So in your essays, such as your research, if you talk about that you had a really awesome experience at Google or Meta or Microsoft, but you don't have a letter of recommendation from them, then some of the reviewers may say, well, why aren't you putting it if it's so pivotal? So in that case, think about it like a movie. It's like a plot hole. When you're writing these fellowships, you want things to flow well, and think about it like a movie or a good book. Good movies flow well. There are not any plot holes. You want to think about The Godfather or some other good movies, but not Sharknado. If you don't know what Sharknado is, just don't. It's a bad movie. Don't watch it. It's a tornado with a shark. It's bad. Don't watch it. So in this case, do think about how you want to have the flow and what is the story of your fellowship application. Because in that case, you want to see how is it going to start and how is it going to end, and how are they going to gain the understanding about it. And that's something that I've always learned from my advisor, especially when writing papers for ICML and NeurIPS. What is the story? And the same thing for these fellowships and for the essays. What is the story that you're wanting to write for that, so that everyone can understand what is point A from the beginning all the way to the end. So then now we're going to go with some examples, and this is with the National Science Foundation, the Graduate Research Fellowship Program, or it's also abbreviated as the NSF GRFP. So if you have some US professors here who are interested and want to learn about the dynamics, here's some interesting things that I'll cover. One thing is that the NSF GRFP will cover 3 years within a 5-year period. A lot of people are like, what does that mean? And that means that when you get the letter of acceptance, you have within 5 years to use 3 years of funding. This comes into action where, say, I'm an advisor, and say I have funding for the first 2 years for this student. I can use those first 2 years because they're going to expire, and then the last 3 years they can use the NSF GRFP so that they have 5 years of funding guaranteed. Or there can be a mismatch of linear combinations depending on when the advisor gets funding, because I know that for my advisor, he has timetables of when some NSF grants are going to end or when they begin. So then they also have to think about which money is going to be appropriated for 2022, 2023, 2024. So then in this case, NSF GRP gives some flexibility of when you can activate it and when you can deactivate it or put it into limbo. And for them, they cover the stipend. It's around $34K. It may increase due to inflation. And it also covers up to $12K tuition allowance. The $12K is per year. So for every year, it'll cover up to $12K of tuition. And then in this case, NSF cares about research and broader impacts compared to grades. And I've heard this a lot with evaluators saying that, hey, I didn't do so well with my GPA, but I have research publications. So then for NSF, they see you have the ability to do research. They understand that there is not a high correlation between a high undergrad GPA to research, because what you do in undergrad and what you do in grad school are completely different, and they understand that if you can show that you have the ability to do research, even if you don't have a superb GPA, you can show them that you have the ability to do it and you have the potential. And I've seen this happen a lot. And also broader impacts is that in their essays, you have to talk about your previous research and your proposed research, and you have to give what the intellectual merit is, so the scientific merit about it. And you also have to talk about the broader impact. So how did it help in the university level or in the research group level, or how did it help in the research community? So you have to think about all the different levels. And sometimes some people do fall into a pitfall about this because they just think, oh, it has to cure cancer or solve all of AGI. No, you have to think about all the different levels. And then here you have 2 essays and 3 letters of reference. So the 2 essays are previous research, proposed research, and here they get feedback. So I'm going to show you some of the feedback they gave me as well as another friend. So of course this is my feedback, and of course this is a very cherry-picked example so that it looks very good on me. So then in this case they talk about, hey, it's excellent academic performance, extensive research experience, because when I was in undergrad, NSF has these summer programs called NSF REUs, a research experience for undergrads, where you go to a university to do research, and I was able to get some publications. And then here the thing is, collectively speaking, the reference letters has evidence his unlimited potential. You want the reviewers to have this mindset to be like, yeah, that person has awesome potential. The letters wrote really well things about them. That's what you want. And that's why you have to make sure that when you talk to the people who will write on your behalf, they will write really well things, because you want the reviewers to write these comments. And then as well as they also look at things on like leadership, because they also want to see how are you going to affect the community. So then another example is with one of my friends. I'm also redacting some personal information, but as you can see, for like when they do the overall assessment, I think the main keywords that they usually do is excellent, very good, and good. I don't know if they ever say something below good. And then of course they're also going to just look at the intellectual merit criterion, and then as well as the broader impacts. So as you can see with my friend, he was not fortunate enough to receive it, but here you still see a lot of good things. So you also have to understand what is the decision boundary between an acceptance and a rejection, as well as NSF GRP does an honorable mention, which is basically you were close to the decision boundary, but you're still getting a rejection, but you were close to it. That's basically what an honorable mention means. And the only good thing is only getting an acceptance. So here you see a lot of positive things in the intellectual merit, but one thing that you see that is very indicative that I didn't highlight is the last sentence. But there is no letter from his PhD advisor commenting on the current research status. My friend was applying as a first-year PhD student, and this is what I call an unfair situation, because in his PhD program, they do not pick an advisor until their second year. So this was something out of his control, and this reviewer has a bias that when the students come in for that professor's program, they get the students automatically. So as you see, that was out of my friend's control, and could have that affected it? It probably could, and this goes back to coherence. You want to make sure that things flow well, and this reviewer was asking, well, where's the PhD advisor? And sometimes if you're applying to a group, maybe talk to that PhD advisor and say, hey, in some of these fellowships, they're going to want to ask for an advisor. You're my potential one. Would you still want to write it? At least you're asking that person to see whether or not, because it may benefit them. Because if you get it, then that means that they have less reduced burden on financial status for you. So that also helps them. So as you can see, there's no reason why to not write a letter of recommendation unless they have their own idiosyncrasies. So then now I go to the Team America Fellowship, the NDSEG one. This one is also a really cool one because it covers tuition and stipend for all 3 years, but you have to activate it the semester next to it. So unlike NSF, you have within 5 years, no, you have to accept this right away, and then the payments will start in the next semester, because they'll award it in the spring, and then the funding will happen in the fall for 3 years. So they cover really good tuition, the stipend, and also they also cover medical insurance up to $1,500. And then also, one thing with NDSEC that I saw is that they're more traditional, because they're also Team America, so then they do care more about grades, but I think that's more of a bias from the Department of Defense. I think they're more traditional. I don't think they sometimes understand like the research, that sometimes you don't need good grades to do research, so I think that may be something that hopefully phase off. And also, one thing is when I applied, I only had to do 1 essay, but from what I heard recently is that now you have to do 2 essays, especially now that I've been a fellowship coach. One of the essays is how you have to pivot your proposed research to the Army, or the Army Research Lab, the Office of Naval Research, or the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. Since we're doing machine learning, that makes it a little bit easier. As you saw Olga Lucia's talk, she's done a lot of really cool stuff with the government in her respective country. In the US, there's a lot of potential for machine learning. It's not just building ballistic missiles that are automated or any of that other stuff. There's other things that they want to do, and there's other things within machine learning with the Department of Defense. We also have Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, which is near us. They're a DoD lab. So that's why, like in this objective, you have to really think what is the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy going to think about, and how should you gear your research towards that? So also look at previous literature that the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force has published that's open to the public, because they also have research that they don't publish unless you have a security clearance. And that you usually need a US citizenship. So then for Ford Foundation predoctoral, they actually have 3 different fellowships: predoctoral, ABD, which is all but dissertation, and then postdoctoral. So then in this one, they cover 2 years. When I got the acceptance, they only covered about 22,000, which is much less than what NSF and NDSEC cover. But in this case, you usually talk to your advisor to see, hey, I'm still providing you $22,000 of free money. Is there a way that you can balance it off so I at least can live comfortably at the institution or the place that I'm living at? As well as Ford Foundation is similar to NSF compared to NDSEG, where they focus on research and diversity efforts because they care about the underrepresented minorities and they want them to succeed. And not just diversity of color, they also care about diversity of thought and bringing different perspectives, just like with Maria Jose Escobar with some of her talks. She's saying, how can you leverage neuroscience with reinforcement learning or different aspects of machine learning? Because there's a lot of benefit to that. There's a lot of good things for interdisciplinary. For Ford Foundation, they also see that, like, how are you going to leverage other interesting ideas that could be fruitful? And they also have a diversity statement saying, how are you going to help either the Chicano community, the Puerto Rican community, the African American community, the indigenous community. So then one baseline that I had thought in my mind, because for the Ford Foundation, you can't find a lot of essays online. For NSF GRP, you can find a bunch of essays, and you can find a bunch of people's evaluations, like the ones you saw from mine and my friends. You can find them online, but for Ford Foundation, it's very difficult. So when I saw that for people saying that for the diversity statement, they would just say how they would contribute, saying that, oh yeah, if that underrepresented minority student is interested in my field, say in machine learning, I'm gonna just help mentor them. But to me, I think that's very basic. That's just not enough, because I imagine a bunch of students are just gonna say that if they're in my field, I'm just gonna help them out. But I'm like, well, is there any other way to change it up? Because imagine everybody else is gonna write that. How are you gonna stand apart? How are you gonna be different? So then in this case, I've been doing a lot of diversity efforts, because for me, even though I was born in El Paso, Texas, I grew up in New Mexico, so my high school was predominantly Mexican, like about 95%. So I knew a lot of the situations. We were also low income. We also had a daycare center because teen pregnancy was really high. So there were some situations and how to address it and how to set up for success, because at my high school, we didn't have a lot of exposure to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because we were also low income. We also had free lunch, which is not something that a lot of high schools have. So I was able to expand on that and say, is there a way that to set up a way between universities and high schools to build a good program, to have mentors in college, but give them core classes that sometimes the high schools cannot provide, because if they're low income, they're not gonna have a lot of electives such as computer programming or 3D printing or other things like in mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering. So I was thinking maybe these workshops to help guide these students so that when they go to university, they feel a little bit more prepared. And I wrote that in my essay, and I have evidence of that in my volunteer experience. There are other people who just write that, but they don't have that evidence. So if you write that and you don't have the evidence of that volunteer, then it seems a little bit suspicious. It's like someone writing a machine learning paper saying, I did all my experiments on MNIST, and I can say that I can generalize this to ImageNet. No one's gonna believe you, because you don't have the results to show that, you don't have the backing. So in this case, if you're gonna want to think outside the box, also do think about that. Do you have the experience or the actions that demonstrate that? Because you can just write about it, but these reviewers, they will know whether or not you have, if you can talk the talk, can you walk the walk, basically. So then other general tips is that apply for any fellowships. If you don't apply for the fellowship, the probability of applying for it is 0%, or you getting is 0%. If you apply for it and follow the directions, it's greater than 0%. Also give yourself plenty of time. Remember completeness, you want everything to be done, especially the letters of recommendation. and also have others review the essays. This is very important so that you can gain an understanding. As well as if the fellowship is from a company, do mention how your research intersects with their research. I've helped some people when they apply for Microsoft, NVIDIA, Meta, and one of the situations I see is that they don't show how their research intersects with Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and so on, and the probability of you getting accepted kind of goes down because for them, they're a company, they have to have an incentive of how does it match and how can it benefit them. And then, of course, there's a bunch of other fellowships. The Hertz one is more of a U.S. citizenship-based one, but there's Facebook, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Google, Qualcomm, and there are others that come and go. I remember Samsung had one, but it only existed for 2 years, and then Twitch has one, Adobe has one, I think Snap still has one, and the company ones do not have a restriction of being a U.S. citizen. You can be an international student while being in the U.S., or sometimes you can even be in your respective country, depending on which of these fellowships, and still apply for it. And then, of course, the other question I get a lot is, how do you find these fellowships? Well, the first thing you can do is Google search, but that can be very expensive if you don't know the right keywords, and you'll probably just get the same fellowships over and over. Potentially ask your advisor, because they either have grad students or maybe postdocs or other students who have won those awards, so they usually like to publicize it. For the advisor, they probably like to publicize it because it's good. It's a good advertising for their lab, because if a lot of people are getting that fellowship, then that potential student wants to join that lab. And then, of course, look at social media, because for the companies, they do want to publicize it and say, hey, we're providing these fellowships for PhD students, as well as talk to your peers or graduate students. You never know who knows which certain fellowships. Like, I found out about the Twitch one. I bet a bunch of people here might not have known about that. And then just to point out, your network is key. You don't know who knows which knowledge and can help you out. And then also, here's this case. It's like a really good problem. What if you get more than one fellowship? For the most case, in my scenario, I was fortunate enough to get the GEM fellowship, the NSF-GRFP in my undergrad year. And then when I applied as a first-year grad student, I was fortunate enough to get NDSEG and the Ford Foundation pre-doctoral. And if you've ever heard the Pokemon tagline, gotta catch them all, I went and tried to gotta catch them all, but you can't accept them all. So in that case, you couldn't keep them. At the end, I only kept the NDSEG one because it paid for tuition, stipend, and medical insurance. And basically all the other ones I had to terminate or not accept. And of course, I would have to keep my department and my advisor in the loop, because if they are thinking about the timetable of how many years I'm going to be in graduate school, and they also have to think, okay, how many years is what grant's going to be go for what, as well as for the department. Because in some situations, the department may be funding some portions of it in either an RA or a TA, or some other form, or mostly your advisor will be paying for it. So that's why you got to let them be aware and everyone is on the same page, because if everyone is not on the same page, that's not a good idea. And then also, what if you do not get fellowships? It's not the end of the world. As I showed you with my friend, there was something out of his control, and it is what it is. Like, you did the best you could, and I give you a good congratulations on that. A lot of people would not even follow through this. So then you wanting to learn and wanting to do this, just go for it. And then there's also other non-fellowship options. They're like not a fellowship, but you still get money. So in this case, like the old phrase, all roads lead to Rome. Some take a bit longer. So then in this case, here's this other example of non-fellowships. Meta has these research awards, as well as Amazon. Your professor or your advisor would apply for it, but the money that they provide is usually like 50 to 100K, maybe 200, 300K. So you could probably help your advisor or PI write the essay, and the money would just go to your stipend or your basically for your income for you to do research, or also to buy equipment. We know that in machine learning, GPUs are very hot, and with crypto going down, GPU prices have started becoming very reasonable. I hope to buy a 3090 soon. And then, of course, especially in the US, professors can apply for grants. Of course, as I talked about, there was the NSF-GRFP, but as you can see with NSF, they do fund multiple different grants. There are professors who apply for these other grants. There's also some other ones called the career grants, which are for early PhD or early professors who have barely graduated with a PhD. And that's a very big one for them, as well as the DoD and the DOE do provide different grants, and they have different timetables on when to do it. Here, I'm just providing the perspective from a graduate student. I'm not a professor. I'm going to go work with Microsoft in August, so I'm not an expert in that. We have a lot of professors here, so do ask them about it, especially in the US or in your respective country, of how do they apply to grants and what is the situation of it, like the different timetables. Especially if you're doing applied machine learning, theoretical machine learning, or very niche areas, you need to see when do you need to apply and What are the ways to do it? As well as when you're applying for grants, some of the professors will base it from the student's research, and basically these grants pay for the student's stipend, tuition, and equipment, because for the PhD, basically your advisor is paying the grants for your tuition and your stipend. For universities, especially in the US, that's why they put a lot of pressure on professors to get grants, because they're the ones funding everything. If you thought that, in the US, if you thought that if your undergrad tuition was going for the university, that's not a big chunk of the pie. It's the professors getting the funding, because there's a percentage that, imagine that they get a $100 million grant, the university will take a percentage of it. And don't think it's in the low percentage, like 0 to 10%. It's around 40 to 60% based on the university. And each university is different. So do think about that. And I don't know how that is in some of the Latin American countries, or in Africa or in Asia. It might be a different system. So that's why in the US, we kind of have the situation that the university will take a good portion right away. So you may think, oh, I got $1 million grant. Now it went down to 500,000. And then from that, you would have to fund students or equipment. So then with my advisor, there was the student, Randall, really awesome person. I worked with him. He wrote a paper, got accepted to ICML, the spline theory of deep learning. After the paper was accepted, he worked with Rich so that they could work on a small NSF grant, and it got accepted. So the NSF grant was accepted. Here's just a picture of just the front portion of the ICML paper. It was ICML 2018. Randall graduated last year, and now he's a postdoc with Jan LeCun in New York University. So as you can see, Randall was always destined to greatness. And then as you can see from NSF, you can see which grants are accepted and how much do they fund. In this one, it was $500,000. But if I'm saying that the universe, I don't know if they applied overhead or not, so I don't know if they already took 50% of this $500,000, which would go to 250. I'm not an expert in that. Talk to some of the professors here in the US to see, do they automatically take the percentage off from here, or does NSF provide additional overhead so that hopefully the professor can have more funding? But I heard in some cases that's not always the scenario. But here you can see that the research as a PhD student, it does have impact, that it can be used to fund $500,000. Imagine how much potential you have. You can do a lot of good things. Like, I don't think Randall ever thought he was going to get a grant that was $500,000. Well, it's on my advisor's name, but the research, the foundation of the research was from Randall, the spline theory. And then, of course, there is the timetable in 2019, and then in September, it's going to end in 2022. And then another scenario is with me. David Brennis is a biomedical engineering student bioengineering student at Rice University. I mentor him. He's in the bioengineering department, electrical and computer engineering. So we just collaborated because of the LatinX connection. Then we wrote a workshop paper and presented at LXAI at NeurIPS 2019 in Vancouver before COVID happened. We had a blast in Vancouver. So then we got the workshop paper accepted. And then once we had more results after that time, David's advisor put a portion of that into an NIH grant. NIH is National Institute of Health. So for NIH, they care a lot about medical imaging, bioinformatics, and all that. So you saw that there's NSF, DOD, DOE, there's another one, NIH, and usually the bioengineering or the biology people kind of dominate that area. So then in this case, we just wrote a workshop paper, and that additional results was used as a portion for the NIH grant, and it got funded. And we were also able to we wrote a journal paper where we're able to do medical imaging for cervical cancer detection in Brazil and El Salvador. So we were able to help out some of the favela areas and to have a lot of impact. And as you can see, the NIH really liked it, and so it got funded. I think in this case it was only 1 year, but as you see, David was only, I think, maybe a second or third year, and I was mentoring him and collaborating with him, and we were able to get an NIH grant awarded. This just to show you that, like, as a PhD student, you do have a lot of potential, and you never know what can happen. And just because you get a fellowship or if you do not get it, it doesn't mean anything. You should not get the rejection and make it demean you. It doesn't mean anything. What you do out of it afterwards is what you should do. Like, if you want to do more awesome things, then do it. You don't need validation from an external agency. So then at the end, I just want to conclude. I do have a Google Drive of all my winning statements with my essay. So if you want to see the different drafts, I write multiple drafts because at the end, it takes multiple iterations. As well as I'm eager to help people with any other fellowship application essays. Just kind of give me some leeway. Don't send it the day before because I might not have enough time. But as I said, I'm always willing to help everyone, because when I first did it, it was a little bit daunting. So I don't want people to go through that same experience. I know it's a little bit scary, especially starting from a bachelor's. And then as well as having fun, it doesn't define you. think about it as a learning experience. And one thing I want to say is that with Ian Goodfellow, he never got the NSF. He got the honorable mention, which in machine learning terms is like you're towards the decision boundary, but you're still getting misclassified. So as you can see, like the guy who helped develop GANs and everything didn't get NSF, but yet he's an awesome person, and he didn't let that stop him. He kept continuing. He didn't hear back from MIT and all these other institutions. He went to University of Toronto and made the best out of it. So no matter what, just think positively and just do what you want to do. The end.
Thank you, CG. We have questions?
Thank you, CJ. That was a cool tutorial about fellowship. I have one question for you, but before I have an announcement. Also in the industry, like Microsoft, that I'm part of Microsoft, we do have fellowship and scholarship that are targeted to specific community, like LatinX. Like when you identify in that community, the pool is much smaller, so chances to get is good as well. Many of the requirements are within US based, so if you're a student in US, that's one of the requirements. But we do also have a fellowship that is targeted for people that are Latin America, that are doing grad school in Latin America. So check it out. I think what CJ mentioned is go online, do a search. You will find that all that information is publicly available. So take a look to it. My question to you, CJ, is in your experience, once one person gets the fellowship, I think you mentioned you cannot actually co-locate two at the same time, but can you apply it multiple times to the same fellowship? How frequent is that, and what is the likelihood to get accepted?
Yeah, like it depends. Like for some fellowships, they don't have a restriction for NSF. For the National Science Foundation, they say that you can apply once as an undergrad, and then you can apply once as a graduate student, either the first year or the second year. When I first started my graduate school, PhD, you could apply twice, one in your first year PhD and one in your second year PhD, but now they took that rule out and you can only apply once. And for NDSEC, they say you can only apply within your first 2 years. So some fellowships will provide a requirement of saying when can you apply and when are the restrictions. Like NVIDIA says you can apply after you finish your first year. And then I think maybe for Microsoft, like the one in the US, maybe your second or your third year for your PhD. So do look ahead of time and see when can you apply for it, and think about the strategy of how am I going to aim for this, because I think maybe for like Google and Meta, you can apply every year, and I think their only restriction is you still need like 2 years left for you to complete your PhD.
Thank you.
We have maybe another question. I have a question. Have you seen maybe a difficult for Latinx in AI when they are applying to fellowships?
Wait, can you say that again?
Have you seen a difficult to Latinx when they are applying to fellowships?
I think like some of the difficulties might be that some of their institutions don't have any facilities to help them, like in knowing how to write grants and having essays. Like for the NSF, there are some minority or like the HSI, like in the Hispanic serving institutions, some of them may not have like these essays or people to help you guide through it unless you know people. So you do see that the people who do well, they keep doing well because they have the system and it's kind of cyclic. So this is why I'm kind of wanting to help. Like I have like my Google Drive. Just Google me, send me an email, and I'm willing to help it out to help this situation, because usually people from underrepresented minority backgrounds, they don't have these facilities, and you have to know the pro tips and the strategies to know how to approach it, because the probability of going through it with not understanding how to write it, the probability is going to be lower compared to if you know how to optimize how your essays are going to be received and how they're going to be reviewed. So I have seen those difficulties, and I hope that maybe there is some change to help through that, and hopefully maybe through these like LatinX and all these other workshops to help bring more exposure to it so that other people can learn from it and be in a better footing, because I don't want people to go through the same situation that I did, and that's why I want to help them out. But of course, it's just I'm also getting a little bit busier, but I'm also wanting to help and work with everything that I can.